And that moves us wonderfully into the panel discussion. I would just like to introduce our final panelist, who we've not yet met, which is Vanessa Tipoki. So welcome, Vanessa. So she's going to be joining us now. Vanessa is from Ngāti Kahungunu, ki te Wairua and Rangatane o Wairarapa. She's a sheep and beef farmer and mum of one and is based in Pirinoa in the South Wairarapa. Vanessa has worked as a lawyer and more recently as a senior environmental planner and director at Kāhu Environmental in Martinborough. She has a passion for freshwater and Indigenous biodiversity and has recently completed the Wairarapa Moana restoration plan. Vanessa was a member of the Ruamahanga Whaitua Committee. She helped to write Te Mahiri Wai for mana whenua in the Wellington Whaitua process, and the latter was developed under the National Policy for Freshwater Management, the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management 2020, and its fundamental concept, Te Mana o Te Wai. So this panel discussion is obviously focused on how to connect people with nature, but we've also had a range of wonderful questions coming in. So tēnā koe, Vanessa, it's lovely to have you join us as well. And we're now going to move into the panel component of the program. But I'd like to give Vanessa the opportunity to begin the panel and a more general question, which is around your connection to Wairarapa Moana and what it means to you.
So I was brought up on a farm that straddles the Taranganui Awa, and I'm now married to my husband, and we're on a farm that straddles the Taranganui Awa. So my life experiences in both those water bodies, which included swimming and also saving fish when the rivers have dried, and also down at Lake Onohe, mean that I can only describe it as a spiritual connection with it. I think it's integral to my well-being. I would like to express kaitiakitanga in terms of those water bodies within Wairarapa Moana, and I want to be able to pass my passion and care for the water bodies onto my son and his cousins. And I found myself in a really privileged position because I've ended up not only living my passion but working my passion. So I feel very privileged.
Oh, well, it's wonderful to have you join us. I was wondering if you'd be able to expand a little bit on Te Mana o Te Wai. It's now the fundamental concept for all freshwater management and decision making. So how will it impact the way that freshwater is managed in Wairarapa Moana, and acknowledging things like the new draft restoration plan that you've been working on as well?
Okay, so Te Mana o Te Wai and the new NPSFM, which came out in 2020, is a national policy directive around what Te Mana o Te Wai is. So the fundamental concept of the NPSFM is Te Mana o Te Wai. The only objective within the NPS is articulating Te Mana o Te Wai by setting out a hierarchy of obligations. So under the NPS, we now have a very clear hierarchy of the river first. The second obligation is around human health needs like water. And the third component of the hierarchy of obligations is around all other consumptive uses, including cultural values, economic values, social values. So now we've got a really clear structure that says actually the water needs to come first. How has that translated into the restoration plan? Well, as much as possible, we've worked with mana whenua to develop a restoration plan that reflects their values and also has the management methods that protect their interests, I guess. So the key principles of Te Mana o Te Wai also include mana whakahaere, so that's giving mana whenua the opportunity to come in and partner decision making at a number of different levels actually, and that will look different from region to region, but it could include co-design of plans, it could include co-management of areas, it could also include co-governance. So as much as possible with the restoration plan, we worked with iwi, with hapu, with marae to identify their freshwater values, articulate them as objectives in the restoration plan, and then we went through a process of identifying what we thought were key wetland sites based on their cultural and ecological values, and then we identified actions and management methods to ensure that those values were enhanced and restored at those key sites.
Kia ora. In terms of bringing, and this is a wider question to the panel, in terms of bringing people along on this journey with us, what do you think are some of the best strategies that we can employ in that space? Would anyone like to speak on that question?
I'll say something. Education. Our children, I'm in Pirinoa, I was born and bred down here, and our kids at school still are not taught about the history of the lake or the people of the lake.
Oh. Kāhu?
Yeah, sometimes marketing is a bad word, especially when it's associated with selling things at an excessive price, or marketing on maximizing profits. But we need to think about how we present Wairarapa Moana. I think that we can do that a whole lot better than we're currently doing, so that people have a think about what that means to them. And so if we're in a flush and forget kind of community, then we're just taking on too many things for granted.
Right. Ian, you look like you wanted to contribute something there as well.
I would just endorse what Vanessa has said about education. Without education, then there's no knowledge, and that's what we've had to date. And we need education throughout the schools and throughout the councils, so that we are cognizant of what Wairarapa Moana is. And until we did the Ramsar project, we weren't aware that it achieved 8 criteria when all you need is 1. So it's a special place despite being a polluted lake, which is another one of the idiosyncrasies of Wairarapa Moana.
So disconnection is obviously a big issue, and connecting and generating support for large-scale change. Thea, questions come through to you, which was, what are some of your key learnings from your work within the environmental education sector that you think are particularly useful for helping us pull the restoration of Wairarapa Moana out of the too hard basket?
Yeah, good. I was hoping I was going to get to answer that question, and that very much aligns what that participant just asked. Yeah, so I think when we talk about education, it's really important to dive a bit deeper and figure out and to explore how we can best connect the disconnected, right? And yes, of course, education is about knowledge and developing competencies, and I love to think about that. Well, knowledge as what are we trying to develop knowledge for? And I'm very much into the theme of, we're trying to create a sustainable and regenerative future. So what do people need to know and feel, and the skills they have for a regenerative and sustainable future? And so that's one part of education, but another part of education is that nature connectedness that I focused on. And it's not, often in education, it swings from one side to the other. Like we focus on knowledge like we've done in the last few decades. And now, people might feel like, oh, we need to focus on feelings and emotions, but it doesn't need to be that. They all go hand in hand. So fostering and in helping people engage with nature in a variety of ways to develop nature connectedness. And then lastly, especially important for our day of age, is empowerment. People can just get so depressed. So making sure education takes heaps of opportunities for others to take action.
Kia ora, thank you for that. And I think part of that as well is, as you're saying, broadening this idea of education to being all the experiences that might bring about connection, tools and knowledge for people. Russ, I was wondering if you wanted to expand a little bit on how you think a sentinel like Tuna can help us understand those stories or create those connections.
Can you hear me? Okay. I guess part of my mahi over the last several years is amplifying the voice of tuna. And we can go back to education once again, or promoting or highlighting. How do we get that voice? How do we hear that voice as a significant inhabitor of Lake Wairarapa? If I can connect also back to the education corridor and maybe highlighting this voice, we're put together a virtual reality tour of Lake Moawhetu. It captures the 4 worlds or reference states that I referred to in my corridor: pre-human, human arrival, present day, and 100 years from today, future aspirations. What does the lake look like with its Māori restored? So we have 4 worlds that our rangatahi, our young people, are able to navigate through online, virtually. We're visual people, and we also like to hear the corridor. So it captures the corridor of our kaumātua, our kuia, as well, as they reminisce, romanticize about a lake that once was, of tuna that was in abundance, and now are calling to us like a voice from the dust to say and remind us. So, you know, we look to their whakapapa, we look to and remind ourselves that these guys were before us, above us, tuakana, so we need to hold them in high esteem with that status, as a symbol, really, of kaitiakitanga.
Kia ora, Russ. This raises this broader question around the voices in the room when decisions are being made, and all of you have touched on co-design and co-development, and I know, Ian, you spoke about it in the establishment of the Ramsar process as well, and I was wondering if you wanted to talk a bit about you know, the opportunities that have arisen from that, and some of the cultural health monitoring that's been taking place in the Ramsar site and the way that was designed.
Well, the interesting thing, Zoe, is that the case study was developed by American students on the end of a Zoom, and they interviewed residents here in the Wairarapa, and they built that up as a suggestion of how to go forward. And what was really interesting for me was that they were able to draw cultural health goals out of the Ramsar criteria, which show that the importance of Wairarapa Moana to the Wairarapa. And so we all need to embrace Wairarapa Moana and make that as like a flag that we strive towards to see success within the Wairarapa.
Kia ora. Vanessa, would you like to add to that? I know we've talked about one of the voices in the room with Te Manawa Te Wai is the voice of the river first and foremost. Well, you're on mute just at the moment.
So it's the new MPC theme is a water-centric approach. So I guess I can give an example of how I think things have changed in terms of the different processes that I worked on in terms of the whaitua process. So both Rawiri and I were part of the Raumahanga Whaitua Committee. There were 14 members. There were only 3 Māori at the table, which was Rawiri and myself and Horipo, who was representing Rangitane or Wairarapa. At the time, we followed what they called was a sort of a balancing of the different values, like the environmental and the ecological and the social and the cultural values. And in my opinion, the economic values were weighted differently to the others. And also in my experience, I didn't think it was a particularly safe place for Māori at the time. With time, and the development of what they called Te Kāhu Taiao in Wellington, it was a very different approach by regional council. So mana whenua had their own project team, which included myself as a planner and others, to help them develop what ended up being their own iwi management plan and whaitua documents. So that process, I don't want to call it the Treaty House model, but it was far more progressive than what we previously had. So now we have a document that's been developed by Taranaki Whānui and Ngāti Rangatira, which speaks to all of those parts of freshwater management, and in particular recommends things like co-governance and co-management, allowing mana whenua and rangatahi to be part of enforcement and monitoring. It brings in a mātauranga assessment tool for monitoring as well. So those are the changes I've seen in a really short period of time. The Whaitua Committee and the Raumahanga started in 2013, and the Whaitua process into Whanganui-a-Tara finished in 2021. So in a short space of time, we've seen quite a few differences. And from a personal perspective as well, and being part of the farming community, I've found that land changes, particularly amongst my husband's age group, have changed significantly from what they were, pre-2013.
Kia ora. Ra, one of the things I wanted to ask you about was around the treaty settlement, and where you think the biggest opportunities are there. And I know you've spoken about this a bit already, but in the role of kaitiaki and kai Taiao as well.
Kia ora. Thank you for that question. Co-governance is an opportunity. So one of the things that happens is if you if you're not heard at a regional level, you can be heard at a national level. And so the national policy statement then determines what the regional policy statement does. And so the regional policy statement can just follow blindly the national policy statement. But it can also introduce things that aren't in conflict with the national policy statement, but build on the national policy statement. And so when we think about co-governance, sometimes we think about people in the room making some direction. But if you make the direction from national policy statements and regional policy statements, then people on the ground are compelled to follow those statements. And so that's one side in terms of the partnership that we might have with government in terms of our treaty partnership. On the other side, in terms of what it can also do, the treaty claims is allow you to be thinking in terms of what we as a iwi have in power, or if we as iwi work with our community, what we have as a community has the power to do things and to change things, and to take up the challenge of what might have previously been a too hard basket. So in terms of some of the things that you talked about in terms of cultural monitoring, there can be some aspects of that. For example, one of the things that isn't in some of our national objective frameworks or the NOFs or the measures of environment are like things like ecosystem health. And so one of the things in terms of the way that we can approach things is one, to work in a mātauranga Māori style that looks at the whole of ecosystems as opposed to parts of ecosystems, and thinking about how all of those elements can be related as opposed to divided out under a reductionist theory in terms of having just sole view of elements. And that way the relationship actually becomes more important between things like plants and water, for example. And so then thinking about those kind of aspects can encourage us to look after our environment. But I think if really there's a thing, so I'm going to say that we need to build on top of that, but actually if there is a thing that's a little more important for us is actually the emotional kind of aspect, you know. So what does an environment bring us socially or culturally, and having those things thought about in terms of ways forward and looking after our environment.
Kia ora. I've got just a follow-up question here from a member of the audience for you, Ra, which is just asking if you could touch again on where the treaty settlement is at, and particularly with Castle Point. So
the settlement is at for 2 treaty settlements, the shared treaty settlement with between Rangitane and Kahungunu, and the settlement or deed of settlement for Kahungunu alone are at the first reading stage. At the first reading stage, a whole lot of submissions will come in, just like any act of Parliament, where you have an opportunity to put forward a submission about your thoughts and everybody's thoughts on the piece of legislation in front of people. And so our legislation's in front of Parliament at the moment. It's receiving submissions. Part of the submissions, part of the legislation is about returning a part of Rangi Whakaoma or Castle Point, part of it, not all of it, or other people, private land, just a part of it is being returned to the country in terms of New Zealand. This has already been done at Pukaha, where Rangitane returned Pukaha back to the government after having it for a year. And so, you know, I will say that Māori, in terms of its deed of settlement, might get returned to it 2% of what it deserves to get returned to it. And so out of the 2%, we're still willing to give back to the nation some of our hard fought for lands that we might have been coming to us. And so that's a bit about the monarchy of people from the indigenous population.
Kia ora, thank you. We've just had a question as well that's come in for you, Ian, if you could expand a little bit on Ramsar and what it is for some of the members of the audience. Or you're on mute.
Apologies. Ramsar is a treaty that was developed in the early 1970s. The name is related to the town where the International Treaty for Wetlands was developed, which is a town in Iran. It was in recognition of the decline of wetlands worldwide. And so currently it has a secretariat which is based in Geneva, and there are delegates. There's a Oceania set of delegates, so there are people from the Pacific Islands, Australia and New Zealand. And so they have developed 9 criteria, mainly to do with wetlands, and to do with either the vegetation species or the birds or the fish. The 9th one that Wairarapa Moana didn't achieve was around being able to show that 1% of New Zealand land animal species was dependent on Wairarapa Moana. Now, for example, there's a lot of research going on locally about bats. For example, if there were several large bat roosts in Wairarapa Moana, it would achieve that 9th criteria. However, to get the status, you only need to achieve one of these 9 criteria. And that's why I've called Wairarapa Moana a jewel in New Zealand. And that's why I put that slide up, which showed the native bush going right down to that large extensive area of native bush on the western side, the large area of wetlands, and also the saline marshes down on the foreshore. To get the status, you have to fill in an application. They changed the damned application while we were doing it. We had to do it twice. And it goes into the dock machinery. And because it's an international treaty, Cabinet has to sign off. So the application has to go through the circuitous route of all the government departments for them to consider and see whether there's anything which infringes their ability to deliver. And that depends on the energy which is in the dock head office, I think, to get it through the bureaucracy, because it did take 5 years. Is that enough of an answer?
Yeah, cool. Thank you, Ian. That's really useful. And I know, and forgive me if I don't quite get the figures right, but is it 98% of the wetlands have been lost from the Wairarapa Moana region? Someone might be able to.
Yeah, well, it's nationally.
Yes.
The other point I make is that this is only the 7th Ramsar site in New Zealand. So there's hardly any. If you went to Australia, there's 600 odd, I think. And so the process isn't very forgiving in terms of progressing Ramsar status.
Yeah, and as Ra touched on as well, you know, they're the lungs of the lake as well, so providing all that filtering and cleaning before the water is going into those highly degraded lakes as well. I've got a couple of questions that are specifically around, you know, some of the land management and the water management that's going on inside the Wairarapa. This was for you. I think probably we could open it up to anybody who'd be interested in answering it. So this question says, can agriculture coexist with a healthy Wairarapa Moana? And if so, how?
Ooh, that's above my pay scale. Yes, it can. So it's all about housekeeping, how you look after your house. So in the cleanup fund, we subsidised works which included riparian margins, but one of the things we also promoted was the development of constructed wetlands. And they have an ability to remove the nitrogen and less of phosphate out of the water, which when it gets into Lake Wairarapa makes it super trophic. So it's likely that you would have to de-intensify some of the agriculture. However, if as wanted, the reconnection of the Ruamahanga to the Lake Wairarapa, then you embrace a very large catchment. And that's where co-governance will be really important to actually develop policies along the lines that Vanessa has talked about to protect the water that will eventually get into Wairarapa Moana. So you can do it. It's a change, but we're all facing change in terms of climate change. So we are going to have to change, and that's why, in terms also of the story about Wairarapa Moana and the prosperity and success of the Wairarapa are so interlinked, because the hinterland directly impinges on the lake or Wairarapa Moana.
Kia ora, Ian. Vanessa, I was wondering if you would like to add to that. So can agriculture coexist with the healthy Wairarapa Moana, and if so, how? Particularly
yeah, I'd tautoko what Ian said, and it comes down to best farm practice, which means educating yourself as to, you know, what the effects are, any adverse effects of your farm practices, seeing the value in restoring wetland areas and constructed wetlands. I know, particularly down this end, we've got organisations like the Aorangi Restoration Trust who are working with private landowners at the moment to restore the Tonganui corridor, and working with adjacent landowners as well around Wairarapa Moana. So the more that people can come on board with that, the greater the buffer will be around Wairarapa Moana. And I think there's a whole lot of exciting opportunities for that to happen. And Ian needs to take some credit for that, because he's been part of the Wairarapa Moana governance group for some time and working with those adjacent landowners. And I think I'm seeing on the ground a shift in the way that farmers are seeing land and river management, ensuring that they're more restorative in terms of their practices. So.
Kia ora, Vanessa. Ra, you've got your hand up there.
Kia ora. So I'd like to make a little difference between the agriculture and industry. If we have a sole product in terms of industry, and we're looking at let's just I was going to take milk, yeah, so let's take milk. And so milk might be having some constraints in terms of its industry on the agriculture. And so if we diversified the product, and so that we included something like, I don't know, manuka oil, and then you've got a two-story farm where on the ground level you can be having cows, and then at a high level, instead of manuka, you could have kānuka, which is quite a lot taller than manuka, but brings some of the same properties. And so then diversifying with a different crop, but also buying into a different industry, like the medicinal industry, or even the health industry, in terms of, rather than just disease, you're looking at health as well. And so in terms of that area, you can then start to say how the agriculture could shape the industry as opposed to the industry shaping the agriculture. And, you know, many grape farmers will be thinking about the wider ideas than that.
I just want to add that as well, and just say that, you know, Māori have this incredible economy down here with its fishery, and that should be something we're aspiring to restore. There's lots of opportunities around nutraceuticals, around tourism. So, you know, the economy doesn't just have to be focused on the primary production as it stands at the moment.
And so I think that really resonates to seeing the opportunity in diversity and diversification, and what those opportunities might bring to the health of the lake and to the people around it as well. A question has come through which is about the Ruamahanga River, and what is the current situation in regards to putting water from the Ruamahanga River back into Wairarapa Moana. Does anyone, this was a question, Ian? Yep.
Zoe, I'll talk about the current situation. The future, that's more Ra's and Vanessa's area. But the current situation is that 98% of the water from the Ruamahanga River flows directly to the sea. Previously, to the Lower Wairarapa Valley Development Scheme, 100% of the water went through Lake Wairarapa. So you've got something which had 100%, now only gets 2% of the flow that goes out to sea. The only time the Lake Wairarapa is connected to the full catchment is in very large floods, and water is directed there and it's used as a flood storage. And so that's how it operates today. There's a gate called Barrage Gates on the southern end of the lake, and that's used to manipulate the levels of Lake Wairarapa. But the future and restoration, that's for Ra and Vanessa.
I'd just like to thank Ian for that hospital pass, thanks. So in terms of the future, in the WIP we managed to do some things, and one of them was to model the Ruamahanga at high flows in terms of a freshet, and so rather than a flood bringing sediment, fresher, bringing a lot more fresh water. If that was to go through Lake Wairarapa and we were putting a metre on top of the lake, we would get an 80% improvement. And that was the modelling, and the first thing that you know about modelling is that often it can be wrong. And so one of the things that was a recommendation was that we would have some research about that, about the better effects on the lake. And so recently iwi have been approached about what research we might undertake and how we might do that. With that, of course, there's a changing landscape in terms of iwi perhaps getting the bed of the lake coming back in terms of both iwi, Kahungunu and Rangitane, and its shared data settlement. And so some of the decision making, while wanting to keep the Department of Conservation designations there, but if we're improving the lake, there's a range of things that we can do. For example, aquaculture and growing macrophytes in containers in aquaculture, and then supplanting them or planting them back into the lake, and so that the growth period and the stabilizing period is less than what we would expect if we were growing macrophytes from the start. So those are some of the opportunities that await the future. I don't know that you wanted to talk to a person as grey as I am about the future, but there you go.
Kia ora. And I think that you've touched already on this next question, which is asking more broadly what work is being done to prevent further sedimentation of waterways that feed Wairarapa Moana. And there's obviously a whole range of innovations, but is there any other work that people would like to highlight or discuss in relation to that question? No? Awesome. Alrighty. Ra?
So we're doing a whole lot of work on wetlands and all along the river. So one of the things that wetlands can do is attenuate floodwaters, but also take in sediment. And so instead of having perhaps stop banks right down the length of the Ruamahanga, if we have areas that can be used in terms of wetlands, then understanding how those wetlands can develop, thinking about the taking of sediment. And so rather than thinking about them just on the Ruamahanga branch of the river, the main stem, what if at the bottom of our subcatchments that we had wetlands there? And so that actually we deal to the problem of sediment closer to the source as opposed to when it gets down to the bottom. And so looking at wetlands is a project that I'm currently involved with in terms of Victoria University, and we're looking at where to place wetlands in the restoration of our environment.
Kia ora.
I'm just going to say quickly as well, I'm not an ecologist, but in terms of sedimentation and suspended sediment in the Ruamahanga River and its stop banks, we just simply don't have a situation where the river can move and allow for that dispersal of sedimentation. So it's shooting in this channel straight down to Lake Onoke and filling that up at the rate of knots. And as far as I'm aware, there's no monitoring of the Cook Strait, so we don't know the effects or implications on the marine environment, but I imagine that they're significant.
Kia ora. Yeah, and thanks for bringing up that connection between land and sea, because often we think of the ocean as our receiving environment, and we don't know much about what's going on when it reaches out there, or the impact on the biodiversity and ecology of those systems as well.
Yeah. I'll just make a quick point on that, Zoe. So the previous iteration of the NPSFM didn't include receiving environments. So the coastal areas, many of which the sites of significance for Māori, were excluded from those processes. Under the new NPSFM, receiving environments are now included as part of Kiutukitai Mountains to the Sea, and that interconnectedness of all water bodies, and therefore they are included in regional plan processes now.
Yeah, fantastic, because the health of those coastal ecosystems is very much dependent on what's happening right back at the top of the catchment as well, and that interconnected nature between all of those waterways.
A key finding from the Ruamahanga Whai Tour was that we want to see the water slowed down. And once that's implemented, we should see some change. And currently, as Ra has said, in terms of flood management, we've got the ambulance parked at the bottom of the cliff rather than actually doing something upstream to actually slow water down, hold sediment, reduce the amount of flooding, and also to let the water spread further. So that's all part of what I understand is in the Whai Tour, and let's have the Whai Tour enacted now.
Kia ora. Russ, I must ask this question before we get to the end of the session, which was about your thesis, and people asking if that was available publicly, and if so, where or at what point you're actually with your research in this space.
Good, Zoe. I'm going through publication, so it's all completed, submitted, marked A++. Not, I'm just joking. But it's available. I can send it through to you, and you can on-forward it to those who would like to have a flick through the pages.
Fantastic, and we can make that link available through the Restoration Day proceedings as well. Awesome. I did have one more question, but of course it's, here we go. All right, and this is one for Thea here as well, which is, how would you suggest, and I think you've touched on this a bit already, but you can be as aspirational as you like here, but how would you suggest to have conversations that create magic and connection to the natural elements? And I welcome anyone else who'd like to follow up after Thea as well.
Oh, that's a nice question. Yeah, I'm wondering who we're having these conversations with, but there's nothing like actually being in the Taiao to have those conversations, and that's what the focus of my research, being nature-based, is all about. So I think as often as possible, have those conversations outside of meeting rooms, outside of classrooms, and yeah, do something a little bit different.
Kia ora. And I really resonated with your description of cultural transformation, and that's something that happens when people are in place, not in a theoretical way, but when all of those other parts of you are moved as well. And so we're kind of coming to the end of this session, and I've had a great question come in, but I just wanted to also acknowledge all of your manaakitanga, and thank you, Russ. It's a fantastic description of all the work that you're all doing and that are contributing to this region as well. So this final question comes from our audience, and it talks about, how do we connect all of these angles? They've said angles, but you could say values or outcomes that we're seeking together as a region. So what would be a way of bringing, another way of thinking, that would be a way of bringing everybody into this conversation and bringing all of these elements together so we can move forward as a region. And I give everyone an opportunity to respond to that question as we wrap up. Anyone want to get started with that?
Want me to have a go?
Go for it, Thea.
Yeah, I guess a lot of the thinking we did with the collaborative community education model underpins that question, and I know Ra spoke about kind of this idea of branding, but you know, that shared vision is so important. Establishing a shared vision for a community, and it takes a while to get that shared vision out there through lots of, you know, education and media and news, but that's, to me, really important to being the glue that holds everyone together and starts a journey. And then I would say, once you get that shared vision and you start your journey, you know, work with the willing, you know, the people who are going, yeah, we want to be a part of that, and showcase their success. And it's just such a ripple effect that, you know, once people are seeing a different way of being and living and thinking, you know, it's that momentum starts to build and get others on board. So yeah, shared journey, shared vision, and work with the willing. And yeah, I think that's enough for me.
Kia ora, Thea.
I'll add my 5 cents just very quickly before the big guns jump in. And there's a number of thoughts that come to mind when we talk about shared vision and so forth, and how do you bring all these threads and weave these threads together from different angles, as you put it. And every region is different, and there's different ways of going about it, but I can't help but see a video that I saw recently of a guy on a hill surrounded by other people, and he was the only one. He got up and he was just dancing, doing the stupid dance, forward rolls, backward rolls, and I think it was right. Can't remember exactly, but and then everyone was looking at him funny. And someone got up, and the second person, the follower, next minute everyone was up. Basically, they created a movement. And as someone just said, Thea, the willing, participating and staying the course, staying strong, is a big part of that. But the movement's already started. I could see that. It's been going for a while, and this is just part of that, this Restoration Day with the focus on Wairarapa Moana. And for me, my signing off, just grateful to be a part of it. I recognise those who have contributed over all these years, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to present and to be a part of it and to share in your vision. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Russ.
Given the space that I'm in, I would say people need to start, regional councils need to start implementing the planning documents that they have, including giving effect to Te Mana o Te Wai as part of the NPSFM. It's pretty simple.
Kia ora, Vanessa.
Yeah, I believe the mahi has been done in terms of the whai tour, and you heard Vanessa say that it started in 2013. It's 2022 now, and I've got a lot older. I'd like to see some action, as I said earlier. And the other part is the stories. I think that the work that Russ and Ra have done in scratching the surface and bringing those current stories to the forefront is the start of a wave that should grow and grow. So bringing those stories and to everyone, not just to a select few.
Kia ora, Ian.
Yeah, Bella. Kia ora, the pressure's on. Sorry. I've got to check with our wider whānau, but one of the things that I think is that that I'd love to do, but this isn't my choice. I have to understand what our wider whānau and our iwi want to do. But I'd love to share the title Tangata Whenua with the rest of New Zealand. Not the tangata whenua that's a whakapapa, not the tangata whenua that's on the other side of tangata tiriti, but those people affected by the environment. If you're affected by the environment, then you could be tangata whenua. And it's, as I said, it's not my place to say that, but it might be the place of the rest of us to live in. Kia ora koutou.
Kia ora.
Kia ora rā, and kia ora koutou for all of your kōrero today and your whakaaro. I feel pretty excited, particularly through this session and everything that you guys have shared today around this creation of a movement and this transformation and the opportunity ahead of us. So thank you all so much for your time and for being with us here today on this panel.